So, a frequent request in the comments is a vampire build, which for those that don't know is a build using the full Trang'Oul set, and while I actually have several to pull from for this, ranging from fairly tame to weird as hell, I figured I'd start with one of the more straightforward builds before we jump into the deep end with the strange stuff, and I was going to focus in on Poison Nova, FireWall, and Summons. Just a general flavor of the beast, which definitely has some interesting perks even compared to a more traditional Poison Necromancer. Before we go in depth on skills and stats, we obviously need to address the elephant in the room, or more precisely, the vampire in the room, since shapeshift is not just cosmetic, but it does have a lot more to it than other shapeshifting forms, and it is also the only form that allows you to use all of your skills while shifted, yes, even things like Zeal and Poison Dagger. The first thing being something that I always forget to toggle when demonstrating the builds, despite it being, well, vitally important, is how Vampire Run Walk works, or more precisely, does not work. The reality is, as a vampire form, your walk speed and your run speed are identical, so running effectively becomes, well, pointless, meaning you can walk and preserve your defense and block rates without any speed penalty, which is one of the big reasons vampire form has been used in the past in a few PvP circles. Next are the blocking animations, or again, as with Run Walk, the lack of them. The vampire form has no block animation, instead falling back on the hit recovery animation when blocking, meaning the only recovery frames you need to worry about are your faster hit recovery frames. And while these are a little slower than the basic Necromancer, they can be brought up to nearly the same speed with only a little more faster hit recovery, and you don't ever actually have to worry about faster block rate, so that makes that a lot easier. The last one that impacts us with this build specifically is casting speed. Probably one of the most well-known of the vampire changes. It makes your casting animations a lot slower, to the point where even the best casting gear, basically you'll only just reach the slowest basic Necromancer casting frames. So you're pretty much going to want to focus on skills with cooldowns rather than spammables. One aspect of this that most people don't know, though, is that vampire action frames are actually really good. So even with just Trang's set equipped and nothing else, the animation itself may be 20 frames, which is really long, but the action will trigger on frame 5. To put it in comparison, the base Necromancer form only reaches an action frame of 5 at over 125% faster cast rate, so you are far less likely to be interrupted while casting as a vampire than as your base Necromancer, unless you have really high faster cast on that base. If you want to know more about action frames, we do have a video discussing them in the context of Enigma that you can find in the description, but I do plan a more in-depth and better laid out guide in the near future covering it on a more broad context, including attacks action frames. On the subject of attacks, though, the vampire form does impact attack speed too, though I will save the details for that for one of our upcoming vampire videos. Stay tuned for it, I do have more of these, since it's not really important for this build, but it is important for some other ones. Let's just say you shouldn't be attacking with this one, even though you do have high poison dagger. What is important for this build is a bit of a decision you should make about max block. Do you want it or not? Personally, after testing both ways, I would say max block is actually worth it, since it helps deal with some of the more frustrating enemies you encounter, and would have actually saved me in some early tests against a Stygian boss pack that wrecked my face. This means getting through enough strength for gear, which actually is not super high, since you only need 81 strength to equip the full set thanks to stat boosts. For block, you can adjust your sockets and equipment to improve it a bit, but assuming that you don't do that, you won't need over 263 dexterity for max block even at level 99, so investing casually every few levels will give you enough dexterity for max block because the base block on the Trang'Oul's shield is 60%, and everything else, well, you should put into vitality, since even with an aggressive playstyle, no meditation aura, this build is fairly reasonably maintaining its mana with the right gear, due to more methodical casting styles and stuff like that, so you aren't spending a lot of mana very quickly, you're just spending big chunks of mana very slowly. As far as the Mercenary, since you noticed I said no meditation aura, I actually swapped in an Infinity on my Holy Freeze Mercenary for this, pretty much exclusively for boosting FireWall potency against poison immunes. This actually worked out quite well combined with my frequent casting of lower resist, giving me a lot of flexibility even against unbreakable immunes. Though you could also go with Might and Pride route and make your skeletons the answer for that type of immunity, it felt nice to kind of make a bit of use of the plus skills on the vampire form gives you, especially to the FireWall and Fire Mastery. On the subject of the vampire form skills, it makes the discussion of the skill tree a bit weird, but not impossible. In this case, I went with keeping my skill set from the Lazy Bones Poison Necro, which comes down to maximizing Poison Nova and its synergies, which works really well with this set, as well as getting my necessary curses, most importantly lower resist, and then putting the remainder of my points into summons to keep the enemy still for my Plan B skills. In this case, level 20 FireWall with level 10 Fire Mastery. Now, if you're going for min-max or even potentially using this as an unexpected Ubers build, you would want to forget about the Firewall and instead tilt away from summons into high-level lower resist, a basic golem, and revives, and use Corpse Explosion as your plan B instead. But this one I wanted effective in the normal game and wanted to have fun with some of the perks it gave me, which Firewall fulfills. And honestly, if you're going Ubers, you'd only want to run 3 parts of the Trang for that, not full Trang. Equipment-wise, a huge chunk of our equipment slots are already called for. Helmet, armor, belt, gloves, and shield are all part of Trang'Oul's full set, and the full set is required for vampire form. The natural bonuses of the set are pretty solid with plus skills, resist, mana regen, not to mention a spattering of fire skills from the sorceress tree. On top of that, the natural mods of the equipment are decent as well, with some of the highlights being poison bonuses in the shield and gloves, damage reduction on the armor, and cannot be frozen on the belt, and several other survivability perks across the board. What we put on outside of Trang'Oul's is pretty much what decides the build, and since we're going poison and fire, we want generic plus skills, so they apply to both the plus firewall and fire mastery as well as our natural skills, and since we can get it, a few perks to poison damage are definitely welcome. This need for generic plus skills does constrain our choices of jewelry a bit, meaning to really boost it, we want Mara's for +2 all, and then your choice of Bull Kathos or Stone of Jord rings. Personally, I went with the dual stones for the mana boost just to make double sure that I don't need to worry about mana, since base mana regeneration is determined by your maximum mana that the stones boost. For the weapon, it's almost like Death's Web was made with this set's function in mind, since it gives plus to all skills and helps our poison damage both directly and through an additional boost to the poison bone skills. There are other weapons that you could consider if you wanted to lean more into the fire skills, but they are all going to pretty much pale in comparison to this combo that allows you to effectively stack up both poison and fire damage at a sufficient level. For boots, I just went with the token War Travelers for quick magic find. You could put anything here, and Inferno Stride might even be fun for the random Trails of Fire, but there really isn't a need to fill in the boot slot. You don't need more resist, you don't need any of the rest of the stuff if you actually have decent charms and gear. Since we're all good in the important fronts, I just went with magic find. Speaking of charms though, I ended up going with fungal charms for poison boosts, and the usual Annihilus and Torch, though really these are all just nice to haves and not necessary to the functionality of this build. In fact, some of my testing of it was done with 0 charms, and it did just fine. So you could go in and pack your inventory up for Magic Find instead if you wanted and be perfectly content with this, or you could get some of your other mods from your charms, like faster hit recovery possibly, and just enjoy it that way. Overall, while this build is not peak meta, and no vampire build really is, for people who love combining fire and poison and like being able to block while walking, it actually does do some fun stuff quite well, and I enjoyed testing it out, and we will be looking at some of the other less traditional vampire builds in the near future. And of course, as always, a special thanks to those who click the join membership link to support the channel, as well as everyone who watches and comments, since your support makes this all possible.